September 1907. A man stands at the edge of a Brooklyn pier in the gray hour before sunrise, and he is shoveling. He works fast, the way men work when they are paid by the bushel and not by the hour. Beneath his boots, the wood is slick with brine and fish scale. Behind him, stacked higher than his head, sit wooden barrels packed with oysters. Thousands of them, dredged from beds his grandfather worked before him, and his grandfather before that. The man does not know it yet, standing in that cold half-light with his hands going numb around the shovel handle. But he is part of the final harvest. Within 20 years, the beds he is emptying will be closed by law. Within a generation, the water lapping at the pilings below him, water so thick with life it once carried the salt-sweet smell of the sea up into the streets of Manhattan, will be declared too foul to touch, too poisoned to eat from, dead, and it will stay dead for the better part of a century. But here is the part that should stop you. Here is the part that more than 100 years after that man set down his shovel, a team of marine biologists looked at and could barely believe they were measuring correctly. Because in the same harbor, the same gray water everyone had written off as an industrial sewer, a place fit only for barges and runoff and the things a city would rather forget, something began to filter the water clean again. Not a machine, not a treatment plant, something alive, something they had deliberately put back by the millions onto beds of crushed shell. And when they pulled their measuring instruments up out of the murk and read the numbers, the clarity had improved in places no one expected it to. The wildlife had returned faster than the models said it should. Creatures nobody had seen in those waters for lifetimes were suddenly clinging to the new reefs. They expected this restoration to take decades just to show a flicker of progress. That is not what happened. I'm Lawson Gray, and this is the story of how a single, humble, unglamorous shellfish, an animal most people only ever meet on a plate, on ice, with a wedge of lemon, is quietly rebuilding one of the most abused waterways on Earth. Over the next half hour, I'm going to show you 3 things. First, how New York Harbor went from the oyster capital of the entire planet to a body of water you were warned not to so much as dip a hand into. Second, how a strange partnership between a high school, a billion shellfish, and millions of pounds of recycled restaurant garbage set out to undo a century of damage. And third, the part the scientists are still working to fully measure, what the harbor itself did once the animals were back in it. Because the oysters didn't just survive, they went to work. And the water answered. To understand why this is so extraordinary, you have to understand what was lost. And to understand what was lost, you have to throw out the idea you're carrying right now. The idea of an oyster as something you order, something small and luxurious and rare. Because that is not what an oyster is. That is what we turned it into. An oyster is not a delicacy. It's an engineer. Picture the harbor not as it is today, but as it was 400 years ago, when the first European ships nosed into the lower bay and the sailors aboard wrote home in astonishment. The bottom of that harbor was not mud and silt and shadow. It was reef, living, three-dimensional, sprawling reef, built shell upon shell upon shell over thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of acres of it, carpeting the sea floor from the narrows up into the rivers, a vast stony forest growing in the dark. Some of the oysters were the size of a grown man's hand, a single shell as long as a dinner plate. They grew on the bones of the oysters that came before them, generation cementing itself onto generation, until the reefs rose up off the bottom in ridges and mounds, hard as rock and teeming with everything that wanted to hide there. And every single one of those oysters was a pump. This is the mechanism, and it's the thing to hold on to for the rest of this story. An oyster feeds by drawing water in through its body and straining out the tiny floating particles, the algae, the silt, the drifting bits of organic muck that cloud the water and choke the light. It pulls the water in, scrubs it, and pushes it back out cleaner than it found it. A single adult oyster, one animal, no bigger than your palm, can filter somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of water in a single day. Now multiply that. Multiply it by the hundreds of thousands of acres. Multiply it by the billions upon billions of oysters that once carpeted that harbor floor, every one of them inhaling and exhaling, straining and clearing, around the clock, day after day, century after century. The entire harbor was being filtered, top to bottom, by its own residents. The water ran clear because something living was keeping it clear. Light reached the bottom. Eelgrass grew. Fish spawned in the green shallows. Crabs scuttled through the reef crevices. It was not a backdrop for the city that would rise beside it. It was a working organ, a vast, slow, breathing machine made entirely of shells. And the people who first lived along those shores understood exactly what they had. Long before the European ships arrived, the people of this coast had been gathering oysters here for 1,000 years, and you can still find the proof of it if you know where to look. Buried under streets and parks and parking lots all around the harbor's edge, there were middens, great mounded heaps of discarded oyster shells piled so high and so deep that some of them stood like low white hills. Centuries of meals layered one shell at a time. These were people who took what they needed and left the reef to rebuild itself, and the reef obliged, because a reef left alone does not shrink. It grows. That was the bargain the harbor offered, and for a very long time, both sides kept it. Then the city came and the bargain broke. It didn't break all at once. At first, the oyster was simply too good a thing to ignore. When the first waves of settlers and then immigrants poured onto these shores, here was a food that cost almost nothing to harvest. You rowed out, you raked the bottom, you came back with a boatload. And so the oyster became the opposite of what it is to you now. It wasn't rare, it wasn't fancy. It was the cheapest protein in the city, the food of dock workers and newsboys, and anyone with a few pennies in their pocket. There were oyster sellers below the sidewalks where you could eat all you wanted for a fixed price until you couldn't eat anymore. There were carts on the corners, the way you'd picture a hot dog stand today, the vendor shucking them open one after another, the briny smell hanging in the street. People ate them by the dozen, by the hundred, raw and roasted and stewed and fried. For a while in the 1800s, this was, by almost any measure, the oyster capital of the entire world. More oysters came out of this one harbor than out of any other place on the planet. And here's the thing about an appetite like that, when it meets a resource that looks endless. You stop watching the bottom. Because the reef, remember, is not just a crop you skim off the top. The reef is the foundation. Every oyster you pull up is a piece of the structure other oysters were going to grow on. Take a few, and the reef heals. Take everything, year after year, faster than it can rebuild. Drag iron rakes and dredges across the bottom and tear up the old shell beds to get at the meat. And you are not harvesting the reef anymore. You are dismantling it. You are pulling the bricks out of a wall that took 2,000 years to build. And you are doing it faster every season because the boats are getting better and the city is getting hungrier, and nobody in that cellar full of laughing diners can picture the bottom of the harbor going quiet. But the appetite wasn't even the worst of it, because while the city was eating the reef from above, it was poisoning it from below. A growing city has to put its waste somewhere, and in those years, somewhere meant the water. There were no treatment plants worth the name. The sewage of millions of people ran straight down the drains, into the creeks, into the rivers, and out into the same harbor those oysters were trying to filter. And an oyster, remember, filters everything. It cannot choose. It pulls the water in whether the water is clean or foul, and it concentrates whatever is floating in it inside its own body. So the very animal built to clean the harbor became the animal that absorbed the harbor's filth. And the people eating those oysters by the cartload began to get sick. Then they began to die. There were outbreaks traced back to the beds, typhoid, cholera, illnesses that swept through neighborhoods and were tied again and again to the oysters pulled from waters that had become open sewers. And so the thing that had fed the city for 2 centuries turned, in the public mind, from a treasure into a threat. The reputation that had made the Oyster King made its fall absolute. One by one, the inspectors moved in and the beds were condemned. Waters that had been worked by oystermen for generations were posted and closed. Families who had raked the same grounds their grandfathers worked were told the grounds were finished, not just empty, but dangerous. By the early 1900s, the great beds were collapsing under both blows at once, the dredges above and the poison below, and the last of the major commercial oyster beds in the harbor were shut down for good in the 1920s. And just like that, after thousands of years, the breathing machine stopped. Think about what that actually meant, down on the bottom where no one could see it. The reefs that had survived ice ages and storms and 1,000 years of careful harvesting did not survive a single century of the modern city. The shells were dredged up or buried in silt. The pumps fell silent. There was no longer anything living down there straining the water clean, and so the water did what water does when nothing is cleaning it. It clouded, it darkened. The light stopped reaching the bottom. The eelgrass that needed that light died back, and the creatures that lived in the eelgrass went with it, and the harbor began to slide year by year towards something that wasn't an ecosystem at all anymore. It became a channel, a thing you crossed on a ferry or dumped into or pushed barges across, but never, ever, a thing you imagined as alive. And for the next 50 years, that's exactly how the city treated it. It became the place where the city put what it didn't want. Factories lined the shore and emptied their waste into it without a second thought. Garbage scows carried the leavings of millions of households out past the narrows and tipped them over the side. Whatever leaked, spilled, or drained from the largest city on the continent found its way, eventually, into that water. There were stretches near the industrial piers where the surface carried a sheen of oil that caught the light in oily rainbows, and the smell on a hot August afternoon was something people who lived through it never forgot. A thick, low, rotten smell that hung over the working waterfront like a lid. You could not see your hand a foot below the surface. Divers who went down to inspect bridge footings and pier pilings described it the same way, over and over. Total blackness, a soup so dense with sludge and sewage that their lamps lit nothing but the cloud directly in front of the glass. The bottom, where it could be reached at all, was a soft gray ooze that swallowed an anchor and gave off bubbles of gas when it was disturbed. In some inlets, the dissolved oxygen dropped so low that nothing with gills could survive there at all. These were the dead zones, patches of harbor where, biologically speaking, there was simply nothing left to kill. And here is the strange, sad thing about a dead place. People stop expecting anything from it. A child growing up along that waterfront in the 1950s or 60s never knew it any other way. To them, the harbor had always been gray and oily and dangerous, a thing you were warned to stay out of, a thing that had never held anything you'd want to touch. The memory of carpeted reefs and clear green water and oystermen working the beds at dawn had passed out of living memory entirely. It survived only in old photographs and in the names of places: Oyster Bay, Pearl Street, the shell middens buried under the pavement. The city was, quite literally, built on the ghosts of those reefs, walking over them every day without knowing it. I'm Lawson Gray, and this is the part of the story where most places simply end. The species is gone, the habitat is wrecked, the memory fades, and the obituary gets written. That is the ordinary ending, but that is not the ending here. Because somewhere in that long, gray middle of the century, something quiet began to shift. Not in the water yet, but in the law, and in the way people allowed themselves to imagine what the water could be. It started with rules. Slowly, over decades, the city and the country began to decide that you could not simply pour raw sewage and industrial waste into a river forever. Treatment plants were built and then expanded. Discharges were regulated, then restricted, then fined. The worst of the poison was, year by year, choked off at the source. None of it was sudden. None of it made headlines. But the cumulative effect, by the end of the century, was that the harbor was no longer actively being killed every single day. The water was still filthy. It was still unsafe to swim in after a heavy rain, when the old combined sewers overflowed. But the bleeding had, at last, mostly stopped. The patient was no longer dying. The patient was simply lying there, gray and still, waiting for something no one had yet thought to give it. And then, a handful of people thought to give it the one thing it had lost. Not a treatment plant, not a filter built of steel and concrete. The original filter, the living one. They looked at that vast, murky, written-off body of water and asked a question that sounded at first almost absurd. What if you put the oysters back? Because here is what those early restorers understood that everyone else had forgotten. The harbor had not failed on its own. It had been stripped of the very organ that kept it clean. You don't fix a body by scrubbing the blood. You fix it by repairing the organ that cleans the blood. And the organ, in this case, was a reef. A living, breathing, self-renewing reef of oysters, each one a pump, each one a builder, each one a tiny piece of an engine that had run this harbor for thousands of years before the dredges arrived. In 2014, that idea got a name and a number and a deadline. They called it the Billion Oyster Project, and the goal was exactly what it sounds like: to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor by the year 2035. Not a few thousand as a gesture, not a token reef behind a museum. 1 billion living animals returned to the water that had been their home for millennia, to begin doing again the work they had always done. 1 billion. Say that number out loud and feel how impossible it sounds against everything you've just heard. The dead zones, the black water, the bottom turned to ooze, the half-century of being treated as a dump. 1 billion oysters in a harbor where you couldn't see your own hand below the surface. To most people who heard the pitch in those early days, it sounded less like a science project and more like a dream told by someone who hadn't looked closely at the water lately. And the people behind it knew exactly how it sounded. They knew the doubt. They had heard it in every meeting room and every grant office. But they had also done the math on what a single oyster could do. And that math was about to change everything about how you think about a single shell at the bottom of a river. Here is the number that the whole project runs on. 1 adult oyster filters somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of water every single day. Not as a special effort, just by living, just by breathing through its gills, drawing the murky water in, stripping out the algae and the nitrogen and the suspended particles, and pushing it back out a little clearer than it came. 30 to 50 gallons, from a creature you could hold in the palm of your hand. Now do the multiplication the founders did, 1 billion of them, filtering in concert every day with no electricity, no maintenance, no human hand on the switch. That's not a cleanup project. That's a living water treatment system the size of an entire harbor, one that builds itself and repairs itself and grows larger every year it survives. The oyster, it turns out, was never just a thing you ate. It was the original engineer of this place, and it had been doing the harbor's most thankless job, for free, for 10,000 years. But you can't simply pour 1 billion baby oysters into the water and walk away. They need something to grow on. In the wild, oyster larvae drift until they find a hard surface, almost always the shell of an oyster that came before, and there they cement themselves down for life. No shell, no reef. And the harbor's old shell beds had been dredged away a century ago. So the project did something quietly brilliant. They went to the restaurants of New York City, the oyster bars and the seafood kitchens that shuck millions of shells a year and throw them in the trash, and they asked for the empties. Today, the project collects millions of pounds of discarded shell, cures it in the open air, and uses it as the foundation stone for new reefs. The same shells that fed the city are now rebuilding the harbor that the city nearly killed. And the larvae that get seeded onto that recycled shell, many of them are raised by teenagers. Because the heart of this whole operation is tied to a public high school, the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School, out on Governor's Island, where students learn to grow oysters the way other kids learn algebra. They tend the tanks, they monitor the water, they haul the cages and count the survivors and dive the reef sites. Thousands of students and volunteers have now passed through this work, which means the harbor isn't just being restored, it's being restored by the generation that will inherit it. Let me be clear about one thing, because people always ask. These oysters are not for eating. The harbor is still too polluted, and that's not the point. The point was never the half shell. The point was the filter. The goal here is purely ecological. Clearer water, healthier bottom, a living structure where there was only mud, and it worked. To date, the project has restored well over 100 million oysters across dozens of reef sites scattered through the harbor. Not a billion yet, that's a decades-long climb. But 100 million is no longer a dream told to a skeptical grant office. It's a measurable, breathing fact. And the reefs are doing exactly what the math promised. They strip nitrogen and algae and particles from the water column, and in the quiet pockets around them, the water has begun to clear. Divers report seeing further than they could a decade ago. Light reaches down where it hadn't in a lifetime. Then came the part nobody put in the original pitch. As the reefs grew, the harbor answered. Crabs moved into the crevices between the shells. Small fish came to hunt them. And then, astonishingly, seahorses in New York Harbor were found clinging to the structure with their curled tails. An oyster reef is what scientists call an ecosystem engineer's masterpiece. A single species builds a hard, complex, three-dimensional world, and hundreds of other species move into the rooms it makes. The oyster didn't just clean the water, it rebuilt the neighborhood. And there's one more job the reefs do, one that stopped being abstract on a single terrible night in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy drove the sea into the streets of Lower Manhattan, and the subways filled with salt water, and the city learned, in the dark, exactly how exposed it was. Oyster reefs blunt wave energy. They are living breakwaters. A restored reef won't stop a hurricane, but it softens the punch, and in a city sitting at the water's edge in a century of rising seas, that softening is no longer a luxury, it's a strategy. So here is where we stand. The harbor that was declared dead, the harbor written off as an industrial sewer for 50 years, is being rebuilt one recycled shell at a time, by oysters grown by school children, doing the same patient work they did before the city had a name. The model has spread now. Harbor restorations in other cities have copied the recipe of shell and larvae and student labor. Full recovery is still decades away. Pollution still pours in after every heavy storm. The next great hurricane is a question of when, not if. The work is far from finished, but the patient that was lying gray and still is breathing again, and it's breathing through gills it grew itself. So I'll leave you with this. We spent a century treating water as something to use up and throw away. Now 100 million small animals are quietly proving it can heal. My question for you is simple. What's the one dead place near you that you think could still be brought back? And would you put in the work to do it? Tell me in the comments. I'm Lawson Gray. Thank you for watching.